And so next we're going to have the folks from LinkedIn, and it's going to be Sandi and Narsi. And I'll have Rajan actually do the introduction. Rajan, are you around?
Yep.
Cool.
Thank you.
Pass the screen, or you're good with this?
All right. Thanks so much, Marco. How's everyone doing out there? I think Sandi will need to share her screen.
All right.
If that's okay.
Yeah. Let me stop my sharing. It's all yours.
Okay.
And by the way, Rajan is one of the board members, and Rajan and I started this along with Jenny, this being TechKnowCon back in 2018. So,
yeah. All right. Thanks so much, Marco. Oh, so my name's Rajan. I am the manager of technical training and documentation at LinkedIn. And at LinkedIn, there's a lot to learn. LinkedIn actually started in 2003. I don't know if many of you are aware of that. So we've been around for a while, and since then our technology stack has grown a lot. So there's a lot for our developers to learn. And we're always thinking about new and innovative ways to scale ourselves. So this upcoming talk is all about, what we're doing in order to help meet the growing needs for learning for our engineers. The name of our project to do so is called Closing the Knowledge Gap. And to help us learn more about this program, we have Narsi, who's the senior manager of developer engagement at LinkedIn. And we have Sandi Friend, who is our wonderful technical instructor and instructional engineer. All right, let's move on. Real quickly, just letting everyone know who our broader team is. We're called the Developer Engagement Team. So this team consists of 4 teams that work very closely together to increase developer engagement at the company. So these teams are teams such as feedback tools. So they help solve the problem for engineers to provide their feedback quickly on their experiences without necessarily waiting for scheduled surveys, quarterly, yearly surveys of their experiences, but they're able to provide their feedback in real time. So that's what that team does. There's a technical documentation team who fosters the documentation and technical writing culture within the company. There's a technical training team that not only onboards all new engineers, but actually grows a technical learning culture through both in-person learning experiences as well as asynchronous learning experiences. And we have support tools, which helps optimize the ways that developers get help when they need the help, as well as optimize ways for teams that own certain tools and technologies to respond to the developers that need that help. So that's the developer engagement team. And so Narsi manages all of these teams, and Sandi is one of our leads within the technical training team. And to tell you more about the ways that developers learn and some of the pain points that they currently have, I'll turn it over to Sandi.
Perfect. Hi, everyone. So I'm going to kind of step us through what our problem is so you have an understanding of where we're coming from, and then Narsi will get into some of the solutions we're working through. So when you are an engineer, training is one of the features that you use to improve skills, but documentation really is your primary go-to for learning new things and learning skills. So, we're looking at how do engineers actually seek knowledge. And we're going to start off by looking at Leia, who is basically a brand new engineer. She's just a month old, and she did complete the onboarding training, which is our boot camp option. And she has completed some tasks along the way to help her navigate through her code base. And now she's starting to create her first microservice. And as she's starting to look at those things, she's now having to find more information and see, how to complete all the tasks that are required for creating that microservice. So she's going to search through several of our different platforms. We have a enterprise-wide search, which is in Cinco. We have Confluence, which is our wiki. We have Repo Docs. We have Slack. We have LinkedIn Learning. We have Stack Overflow. Excuse me. And we have our engineering university where all of our training is located. So there's quite a few different places for her to go and look for information and find the things she needs. But as you start to look at all these places and really delve into the information that's there, she's finding issues in all of these areas. So things like the search quality is low as you're looking at our enterprise-wide search. It's not necessarily bringing things that are most relevant for her to the top of the list. Things that are in our wiki are outdated. It's hard to find the repo docs. They don't show up correctly in search. How do I know which person to Slack? Who has the right answers, right? And then you go into LinkedIn Learning and or into questions or into engineering university. And you may or may not find the information. And how do you know what is relevant and what really connects to you? So you can see as she's trying to look for information, there's so many places for her to look at. It's really hard for her to find what she needs. And then things are stale. There are gaps in the content. Some of this knowledge is just tribal knowledge. It's in people's heads. We heard that in the first presentation that, people react different in the workflow when giving information versus just being asked on the fly to give information. So a lot of it's in people's heads. So it really can be very frustrating for her to be able to find what she needs to work with. Now, on the flip side, not only do we have the people who are trying to use this particular content, but we also have Diego. And Diego is the one who's creating. He is the one who's creating the tool that Leia is using. And he is trying to balance improving the tool and supporting the tool for all the different developers. And although he realizes he probably should be updating content, it's not a priority. He basically doesn't necessarily get the time to update the content. And then when he is updating the content, he's not always sure of the audience of the best way to update the content. So he tends to update it based on the tool as opposed to updating it based on the workflow that the user is using or doing. So as you start to look at these two people, Leo and Diego, this is not unusual. I'm sure all of you guys have run into the same kind of situation as you're looking at your content. And so we really had to kind of sit back and figure out what was going on in our world and what were some of the things that we needed to think about. So as we looked at these challenges, we had to first look at the fact that we have scale that we're dealing with. So, we have 5,000 engineers with over 100 tools that they have to learn. And nearly all of those tools were created in-house. Right. And then we talked about the fact that there's so many different places for these people to go and look for information. So it can be very confusing. So as we started to look at all this stuff for, trying to foster a knowledge sharing culture, we realized that there was a lot of confusion going on with who owns the content, who's maintaining the content, where's this content located, how can I actually make this content more activity focused instead of tool focused? So there were several different key things that kept coming up for us. So we decided to focus in on 3 main pain points. So the first one was discovery. We needed to make it easy for people to discover the content. So the content lives in too many places. How can we resolve that? The second part was the search relevance. Even when we are doing a search, we have a lot of problems with stale and outdated content coming to the top of the list, or the keywords are not matching up. So the content that really is relevant is not making it to the top of the search list. So how can we improve that? And then the third piece what we found was the content quality. We really did need to clean out or figure out how to keep this content relevant and up to date. And, we looked at the fact that we actually have quite a bit of content that is available, but it's stale or it is incomplete or it is in the wrong audience. So, looking at the quality of it and how we can improve that. So as we took these 3 pain points, we decided we needed to come up with some, solutions. This is where we're going to move into our solution. And Narsi is going to talk about how we are actually solving these problems.
Thank you, Sandy. Thanks, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. uh, so, so we talked about the problem space a little bit. As you can see, there's like 2 personas, if you will, that we really are trying to cater the solutions to. One's basically Leah, who's consuming the information. And then there's Diego, who's wanting to maintain good quality content with less amount of effort and low amount of investment. So let's talk about the solutions that we're trying to kind of put in place for both of these personas, if you will. So starting with Leah. So the key thing that we talked about was there's so many corpora of knowledge sources. So going between Wiki, going between Cinco, the internal search site, and then going to Stack Overflow, question and answers, learning sites. People just don't know where to go, right? So one of the things that we figured was, you know what, we could actually consolidate these corpora into content that can be searched from anywhere. Like you go to any of these places, you should be able to search across all of these corpora together. So basically we tried to kind of say, we'll have a consolidated search story where all of this content will be indexed, and the content will actually, results come up from any of these corpora irrespective of where you search from. So that's one of the elements of trying to reduce pain for users when they accidentally land on the wrong place looking for content. So that's basically step 1. Step 2, of course, is the holy grail of actually having great internal search. We continue to work on relevance. So that's an ongoing effort that we continuing to improve. The other related aspect in here is the actual ingestion of the content itself. Earlier, not all content was actually even being ingested or was possible to kind of ingest depending on where the content was actually coming from. So we're introducing this mechanism where we actually can create search platform as a service within LinkedIn, so that each of these additional sources can easily plug in so that ingestion can happen easily. So that's basically about discovery of information and making information available to the consumer. So coming to the producer side of the story, which is basically helping Diego spend very little effort, but maintain the content. Here, the problem is a little bit more nuanced if you think about it. So here the issue is, to begin with, we actually have a culture problem. Culture to begin with around ownership, right? If you think about it, there's like when Leah is consuming something in a particular workflow, she's not necessarily thinking about a particular tool, right? She's actually thinking about, how do I get my activity complete? How do I finish my workflow? Whereas when you think about Diego is thinking about, okay, here's how to use my tool, right? So sometimes you have to use like multiple tools to kind of complete a workflow. Now, who exactly owns the stitching together of all of these documentation that's much more bottoms up into something that can be easily consumed by Leah? So I think that's one of the key things that we're focused on, is in kind of establishing that clear ownership at a consumable activity level and a workflow level. So that's one thing in terms of a culture change, because without knowing who is accountable, nothing's going to improve. Number 2, visibility into the state of affairs. So right now, it's all about developer sentiment around the knowledge gap is the only metric we have, unfortunately. So what we're trying to do is actually institute a set of metrics that we can share with all developers, tool owners, to know the state of affairs with respect to the content quality, content staleness, how much content is being used. So that's the second part of the culture change that we're talking about. In addition, we're also working on additional content management tooling, or linters and detecting stale stuff, where is some dupe stuff. So I think we not only want to encourage ownership, but also want to make it easy to own something, right? So those are the two elements of it. Last but not least, around the tooling is also creating clear guidance and training to kind of write good docs, right? That's another important piece that we feel is going to actually add a lot of value. So helping the Diagos of LinkedIn to kind of really write better documentation and making it easy for them, and knowing where the documentation stands today and how it's being used is an aspect of the culture that we're trying to change. And there's a very specific aspect around staleness. um, Rajan was actually alluding to this great analogy where he was talking about, you buy a car, you leave the parking lot of the dealer and you drive out from there, and there's already depreciation. So it's worth a little less than what it was when you bought. So similarly, content, the moment you actually generated and published, it starts to decay in its freshness to begin with. Uh, so staleness is something that we're tackling head on to kind of detect and put in heuristics to kind of say what's actually become stale, what people are actually having challenges with, getting feedback back from users in terms of content quality. So that's basically another aspect around the content quality. So our strategy, like you can see, is a combination of how we can help Leah find information and Diago spend less time getting the right information in front of Leah. So with that, I just want to talk a little bit about metrics. I will not spend a lot of time in the interest of time, but uh, one of the key things that we were struggling with was, how exactly do we measure the knowledge gap? Because we don't know what people don't know, right? It's very hard to kind of go measure that. So what we thought was, okay, we cannot measure what they don't know, but we can measure the impact of they not knowing something, right? The impact of not knowing is that you take longer to finish something. You basically struggle, you go here, you go there, and you take longer time. So through the instrumentation that we have, we do know when there is a new user trying to kind of do an activity for the first time or from the recent past. And if we do know that this user hasn't been using this tool and hasn't performed this activity in the recent past, if we said that user is a novice user versus someone who's been doing the same thing again and again, if we can kind of look at the ratio of how long it takes for the novice to kind of finish something versus how long it takes for an expert to kind of do something, that's an indicator of the delta between knowing how to do something well versus struggling to kind of do something. And that's really how we're thinking about metric in here to be put in place. So there's some additional next level metrics, but that's the key metric that we kind of after at this point in time. So with that, let's move on to a little bit of futuristic thinking that we also were talking about. So the thought in here is that today users, Leah, has to go to these places, various different portals that Sandi was showing, to kind of go look for information. So the thinking was, what if we reverse that concept on its head and basically said, what if the information comes to Leah when she needs it? Okay, how is that possible, right? So it would be possible if we can actually get the context of the activity that Leah is trying to do from the tool itself. So if she's in a tool trying to build something or deploy something, you know the fact that someone's trying to deploy and they ran into this error, right? So can we actually plug in the right troubleshooting information when they run into that error right into that tool itself? So this means that Leah doesn't actually have to switch contexts. Leah doesn't actually have to go ask for someone. And we are able to potentially recommend something to Leah. Of course, this does require us to actually have a good content labeling and content mapping so that we can actually go present the right information in all of these tools. But that's really our proactive content landing up at the user's doorstep thought for the future. So with that, I want to thank you all and open it up for any questions.
Okay, thank you so much, Narsi and Sandy. We have some uh, some questions starting to trickle in. This is from Marianne. How long would a content recommendation system take to build, and what kind of effort?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I think the key thing to, so when we looked at it, there are multiple ways to kind of approach this. One way to approach this would be through a deeply personalized, contextualized search like system, similar to the way you see some of LinkedIn feed or Facebook feed or stuff like that. That's much more personalized for a given context. That's one way to think about it. Another way to think about it is if you are able to label your content associated with a particular situation, very similar to how you'd see a lot of search engines providing instant answers to a fixed set of queries and fixed set of questions. We could get a head start while we continue to kind of make our search and automatic recommendations actually get better over time. So in terms of the cost, we're experimenting with it, and we think we actually can do the later model, which is basically the specific set of queries, specific set of situations, and predetermined set of content as our first step. And then we'll evolve that as we go.
Well, Marianne, do you have any follow-on questions to that?
I think that was really interesting. Thank you for that. I was just kind of curious, like when you say that, it kind of reminds me of like Netflix and how they have like a recommendation system, except you're doing this for like classes and like things that you would teach your engineers. So I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, and it does take a certain amount of engineering effort. So this isn't a system that we're purchasing, but it's a system that we're implementing at a very deep level across different tooling around the company. And take some time to both design, curate, and build. We have a question from Andrew. Can you unpack how you'd see the just-in-time learning appearing for an engineer who runs into a challenge problem while coding?
Yeah.
So Sandy or Narsi, if you'd like to.
Sure. So one of the things that we do have at LinkedIn is that we actually have an IDE plugin, and we also have an internal tool that we use as people, command line tools that people use when they're actually going through their coding and actual development phase of their process of getting code to production. So during that phase, we can actually hook in into the IDE through the IDE plugin or through that tool And each time that barfs and basically gives you an error, we are able to have that query with that specific error and actually have a predetermined list of content that's available for them. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's really cool. That's neat to use the errors that are thrown as kind of a way to identify possible content that could be relevant. That's neat.
Yeah, yeah, we're always looking at different ways to experiment with how to share and broadcast these recommendations. You know, the IDE and command lines are definitely great ways to share that content. You know, there's also other channels such as chat, you know, chat bots, email, more of a traditional channel. But you know, without really context switching that much, I think things like IDE and command line would be, you know, great channels to share information. All right, we have a question from Sasha. How do you think about defining ownership of content describing the end-to-end tasks users are attempting to accomplish versus a specific step, tool, service, or framework? As was mentioned, the challenge often at the seams, which are not well owned since they typically don't map to any specific team or person.
Yeah. So this is one of the things that we're actively addressing right now. So one of the things that we actually have done at LinkedIn is taken a look at the kinds of developers that we have and what top level activities that they do. So that is like, think of that to be a taxonomy that we started to build. And what we're doing right now is from that list of activities, we're trying to tie various aspects of our engagement back to those activities. We want to collect feedback based on those activities. We want to enable troubleshooting based on those activities. And we actually are identifying clear owners with one accountable name against these activities. And they're going to help process all the feedback and then disseminate that to various tools that actually contribute to that particular part of the problem. So that's manual, laborious initial work, but the hope is that the number of such activities that will evolve over time is going to be limited. So we're hoping that there's going to be some initial work, but then a minimal amount of sustenance work to keep that list up to date. And we're also looking into some more interesting metadata like language systems that can actually capture a lot of this information and ownership and store it in repo itself. That's another thought for the future.
So here is a question from Odessa, +1 by Marianne. What are you doing to actually change the culture around content ownership?
Yeah, this is actually one of the most difficult part of the problem we're trying to address, honestly. The challenge so far has been you have a central documentation team. The assumption naturally would be that if there's a piece of content that developers use, the default owner would be that team. So one of the first things that we wanted to do was to help scale the content. We have like John was talking about, we have 380,000 just wiki pages. If you think about it, and there's no way a small 5-6 member team is going to be able to maintain and update and manage and understand all the technologies and do that, right? So one of the things that we are doing is basically spreading very clearly the message that the actual ownership of that content is going to be with the tools owner who actually is developing the tool. That's one. But we will facilitate through providing visibility into the health of that content. We will facilitate through providing training and skills to kind of templates and training. We'll also help with the additional automation tooling that we'll build. But one, making sure very clearly through communication that there is clear accountability at the tool owner level, just like It used to be before where you had a separate testing team and a separate development team, where there was an understanding that tests are going to be owned by the other team. And that has changed. So we're looking at a very similar approach here to say the team that owns the tools actually is the one that owns the docs associated with that. In-repo docs is one way that will also kind of help facilitate this, where you make certain code changes and update your functionality. You also update your content associated with that functionality as a part of the same update. So that's another tool. And providing broad visibility into the metrics and the health is another way to kind of really the wall of fame, wall of shame model, where you really showcase where things are. That will also kind of encourage people to update their content.
Yeah, Narsi, if you don't mind me adding too,
Please go ahead.
from Narsi mentioned some of how we can reinforce some of this ownership, but more from a people perspective, the data and evidence that these things can collect, we can then go to managers and executives and really start that conversation about accountability and ownership, and even start those conversation of how that applies to job expectations, things like career development, career growth. So all of these work together very symbiotically. Do we have any other questions? Okay, cool. Those were great questions. And thank you so much, Narsi and Sandi, for speaking with us today about how we could capture knowledge gaps and start to solve the knowledge gap problem at our company. And so thank you very much for joining us.